January 15th, 1919. A cold, crisp morning in Boston's North End. The kind of winter day where the air bites, but the sun still glints off cobblestones and brick facades. Children bundled in wool coats walked to school. Dock workers trudged toward the wharves. Horses clopped along Commercial Street, their breath steaming in the 40-degree air. And above it all, looming like a silent sentinel over the neighborhood, stood the Purity Distilling Company's molasses tank. A colossal steel cylinder, 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter, painted a dull brown to resemble the thick syrup it held. Inside, 2.3 million gallons of molasses, enough to fill nearly 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools, pressed against its riveted walls. A substance both mundane and vital, used not just for sweetening bread or baking beans, but for distilling industrial alcohol, a key ingredient in wartime munitions. World War I had ended just 2 months earlier, but demand remained high. And the tank, rushed to completion in 1915, had never been properly tested. Workers had heard ominous groans from its seams. Neighbours complained of leaks so constant that local children would bring buckets to collect the free syrup. Some even licked it from the streets. Yet no engineer had ever filled it with water to check its integrity. No independent inspector had signed off on its safety. And on this unassuming Wednesday, at 12:30 in the afternoon, as lunchtime conversations drifted from tenement windows and factory whistles echoed in the distance, the unthinkable happened. A low rumble. Then a sound like a freight train tearing through the sky. The tank didn't just leak, it exploded. Steel plates ripped apart with the force of a bomb. A wave of molasses, 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour, surged outward like a dark tsunami. It flattened everything in its path. Brick buildings crumbled. Wooden storefronts splintered. A city-owned freight wagon was tossed like a child's toy. The firehouse on Commercial Street Engine Company, 31, was wrenched from its foundation, its doors blown inward by the sheer pressure. Horses were swept off their hooves, trapped in the thick, viscous tide. People running for their lives found their legs mired in seconds. The molasses wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. It filled alleyways, courtyards, basements. It seeped into cellars where families kept their winter stores. It coated lampposts, streetcars, even the branches of bare winter trees. And as the temperature hovered just above freezing, the syrup began to cool and thicken, turning from a flowing flood into a sticky, tar-like trap. Rescue efforts began immediately. But how do you save someone drowning in molasses? Firefighters, police, sailors from the nearby USS Nantucket, and ordinary citizens waded into the mire. They pulled survivors from windows, dug through debris with bare hands, fashioned stretchers from doors. But every step was a struggle. Boots stuck fast. Tools became useless. The very air smelled of burnt sugar and despair. For days, the rescue turned into recovery. Bodies were found under collapsed walls, pinned beneath wagons, curled in corners where they'd sought shelter. Among the dead, Antonio Di Stasio, just 9 years old, on his way home from school. Firefighter George Lay, crushed inside the firehouse. Laborer Isaac Gonzalez, who had been walking to work. In all, 21 souls lost. 150 more injured. Many with broken bones, internal trauma, or lungs damaged by the dense, syrupy air. In the weeks that followed, Boston tried to clean itself. Salt water from fire hoses washed the streets, turning the harbour brown for months. Sand was spread like snow, but the smell lingered, and so did the questions. Who was responsible? The tank belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the parent firm of Purity Distilling. and evidence quickly mounted that corners had been cut. The steel used was too thin, the rivets brittle, the construction overseen by Arthur Gell, a company treasurer with no engineering background. He had ignored warnings, skipped safety protocols, even painted over leaks to hide them from inspectors. Yet when lawsuits were filed by victims' families, the company denied all fault, blaming anarchists, sabotage, even the recent end of Prohibition-era alcohol demand. What followed was one of the longest and most complex civil trials in Massachusetts history. 3,000 witnesses testified over 6 years. Engineers debated metallurgy. Chemists explained how temperature and fermentation increased internal pressure. And slowly, a new legal principle emerged: that corporations could be held accountable, not just for what they did, but for what they failed to do. In 1925, the court ruled decisively. US Industrial Alcohol was liable and ordered to pay $300,000 in damages, nearly $5 million today. More importantly, the case spurred sweeping changes. Boston enacted stricter building codes, required engineering certifications, mandated pressure testing for large storage vessels. It became a quiet turning point in American industrial regulation, a moment when public safety began to outweigh corporate expediency. And yet, the flood remains oddly forgotten, overshadowed by grander disasters, dismissed by some as a bizarre footnote. But for those who lived near the tank, who lost fathers, brothers, neighbours, who scrubbed molasses from their floors for weeks, it was anything but trivial. It was a lesson written in syrup and steel, a reminder that progress, when rushed, can drown the innocent, and that even the sweetest things can turn deadly. In the decades that followed, the site of the disaster slowly faded into the urban fabric of the North End. The tank was never rebuilt. The land was cleared, paved over, and eventually became part of Langone Park. A quiet green space with benches, a playground, and a view of the harbour. Few visitors paused to consider what once stood there. But if you walk along the edge of the park near Commercial Street, near the spot where the firehouse once stood, you might notice a small plaque, modest, unassuming, installed in 2019 on the centennial of the flood. It reads simply, "Site of the Great Molasses Flood, January 15th, 1919. No dramatic language, no names of the dead, just a date and a fact, as if the city itself prefers to remember without dwelling. Yet the echoes of that day ripple far beyond Boston. The legal precedent set in the Molasses Flood case quietly influenced engineering ethics nationwide. It helped establish the principle that professionals must prioritize public welfare over profit or schedule. By the 1930s, the American Society of Civil Engineers had formalized codes of conduct, requiring peer review, material testing, and accountability. Standards that would later underpin everything from bridge construction to dam safety. The molasses tank, in its catastrophic failure, became an unlikely catalyst for modern infrastructure integrity. And the science behind the disaster? It was only fully understood decades later. In 2016, researchers at Harvard and MIT recreated the conditions in fluid dynamics simulations. They confirmed that the combination of a full tank, unseasonably warm temperatures after a cold snap, and structural weaknesses created a perfect storm. The molasses, warmed to around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, had fermented slightly, producing carbon dioxide that increased internal pressure. The steel, already stressed from poor construction, gave way catastrophically. The wave's speed, 35 miles per hour, was not myth, but physics. A dense fluid moving with the momentum of a freight train. Still, the human dimension lingers most. Consider the story of Maria di Stasio, who lost her son Antonio. She never sued. She simply moved away, heartbroken. Her grief folded into the silence of immigrant life in early 20th century America. Or firefighter George Leahy's widow, who received a modest settlement but spent years advocating for better safety gear for first responders. Their voices weren't in headlines, but their losses shaped policy in ways they never knew. There's a paradox here, a substance associated with comfort, with home, with the humble sweetness of daily life. Molasses was in gingerbread, in baked beans, in the rum that warmed sailors' nights, became an agent of destruction. Not through malice, but through negligence, through the quiet assumption that good enough would suffice, that a tank holding millions of gallons didn't need rigorous oversight, that the working-class neighbourhood beneath it could bear the risk. And that, perhaps, is the deepest lesson. Disasters rarely arrive with fanfare. They grow in the gaps between care and convenience, in the skipped tests, the ignored complaints, the decisions made in boardrooms far from the streets they affect. The Boston Molasses Flood wasn't just about syrup. It was about trust, about who gets protected when systems fail, and who is left to clean up the mess. Even today, engineers studying structural failure visit the site. Students write theses on the fluid dynamics of non-Newtonian substances. And every January 15th, a small group gathers at the plaque. Some bring flowers. Others simply stand in silence. And if you listen closely on a still winter morning, past the hum of traffic and the cries of gulls, you might almost hear the ghost of a groan, the whisper of rivets straining. A warning from the past, sticky and slow, but impossible to ignore. Because the truth is, the molasses never truly left. Not just in memory, but in the city itself. Long after the streets were hosed clean, residents swore they could smell it on warm summer days. A faint, caramelized sweetness rising from basement cracks or sewer grates. Old-timers claimed that during the 1940s, when workers dug new foundations near the harbour, their shovels struck pockets of hardened syrup, dark and glassy, preserved like amber. Even the Boston Harbour, scientists later noted, showed elevated sugar levels for months after the flood, feeding microbial blooms that altered local ecology in ways never fully documented. The flood also exposed the fragile social architecture of the era. The North End in 1919 was a mosaic of Italian immigrants, Irish labourers, Jewish merchants and black dock workers' communities, often overlooked by city planners and corporate executives alike. Many victims spoke little English. Their testimonies in court were filtered through interpreters. Their losses minimised in early press reports that sometimes mocked the absurdity of drowning in molasses. Yet it was these very neighbours who formed the first rescue chains, who shared blankets, food and spare rooms in the aftermath, their solidarity standing in stark contrast to the distant boardrooms that had deemed their safety expendable. US industrial alcohol, for its part, never admitted moral fault, even after the verdict. The company absorbed the payout as a cost of doing business, and within a decade, it had merged into larger chemical conglomerates, its name fading from public view. Arthur Gell, the man who oversaw the tank's construction, retired quietly. He never faced criminal charges. No one did. The law at the time offered no mechanism to punish negligence that stopped short of intentional harm. A gap that the molasses case would help close slowly, over generations. Meanwhile, the Firehouse Engine 31 was rebuilt on the same site, its new foundation anchored deeper, its walls reinforced. The firefighters who returned spoke of a lingering unease, of dreams filled with thick, dark waves. But they also carried forward a new vigilance, inspecting nearby structures, reporting suspicious tanks, advocating for citywide safety audits. Their trauma became institutional memory. In popular culture, the flood drifted in and out of awareness, referenced in novels, mentioned in trivia books, occasionally dramatized in radio plays during the 1930s. But it lacked the epic scale of the Titanic or the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It was too strange, too sticky, too sweet to be taken seriously as tragedy. Yet that very strangeness is what makes it enduring. It defies easy categorization. It is both farcical and horrifying, mundane and apocalyptic. A disaster that feels like a metaphor for how ordinary systems, when neglected, can unleash extraordinary chaos. And perhaps that's why it resonates now, more than ever. In an age of aging infrastructure, of climate-driven floods, of corporate accountability under scrutiny, the Boston Molasses Flood stands as a quiet parable, not of malice, but of inattention, not of evil, but of the cost of assuming someone else is watching. The plaque in Langone Park may be small, but the questions it raises are vast. Who is responsible when technology outpaces wisdom? When profit margins eclipse precaution? When the people who build the world for us never walk the streets they shape? 100 years later, the answers remain works in progress, written not in stone, but in policy, in engineering standards, in the quiet choices of professionals who choose to test the tank, even when no one is watching. Because the next great wave may not be made of molasses, but the lesson is the same. It may come as a burst pipeline beneath a city street, a dam weakened by years of deferred maintenance, a chemical plant ignored until the wind shifts, the form changes, but the pattern holds. And Boston's syrupy catastrophe remains one of the earliest modern warnings that infrastructure is not inert. It breathes, strains, remembers. And when pushed beyond its limits, it breaks with terrifying speed. Consider the timeline. The tank was filled to capacity just days before the rupture, not for local demand, but because the company feared new wartime regulations might restrict molasses shipments. So they stockpiled, prioritizing inventory over integrity. A decision made in a ledger, paid for in lives. That tension between efficiency and safety, between short-term gain and long-term consequence, still defines our relationship with the built environment. And yet, amid the failure, there was also resilience. Within hours of the flood, Boston's immigrant communities organized soup kitchens in undamaged tenements. Nuns from St. Leonard's Church tended to the injured in hallways slick with syrup. The Red Cross set up a temporary morgue in a nearby school, and volunteers, many of them teenagers, worked through the night. Their clothes stiffening in the cold molasses, their hands raw from digging. No one waited for permission. They simply acted. That spirit of communal response would echo in future disasters. From the 1919 flood to 9/11 to Hurricane Katrina, reminding us that while systems fail, people often rise. But reliance on heroism is not a substitute for sound engineering. It is a stopgap, a bandage on a wound that should never have opened. The court's final judgment in 1925 did more than assign blame it redefined duty. Judge Wilfred Bolster, presiding over the case, wrote that a corporation cannot hide behind the claim of ignorance when it chooses to operate without expertise. Oh, a line that would be cited in cases involving everything from bridge collapses to pharmaceutical recalls. The Molasses Flood became a cornerstone of tort law, quietly shaping how liability is understood in the industrial age. Even the physical cleanup offered lessons. Crews discovered that salt water worked better than fresh to dissolve the syrup, that sand absorbed it but made the ground unstable, that horses, once coated, had to be shaved or risk infection. These hard-won insights informed emergency response protocols for decades, especially for spills involving viscous or non-aqueous substances. Today, if you visit the Boston Public Library's archives, you can read the original testimony, the shaky handwriting of survivors describing a black wall coming down the street, the dry technical reports of metallurgists analyzing fractured rivets, the ledger pages showing how the tank's steel was purchased from a supplier known for substandard batches. It's all there, the human and the bureaucratic intertwined. And every January, on the anniversary, a local historian named Stephen Puleo, author of the definitive book, Dark Tide, gives a walking tour of the North End. He stops at the plaque, yes, but also points to the angles of surviving brick walls, the width of alleyways, the elevation changes that shaped the flood's path. He reminds listeners that history isn't just dates and deaths. It's physics, policy, and the weight of a single poor decision multiplied by 2.3 million gallons. The flood also altered Boston's skyline, not through grand monuments, but through absence. No massive tank was ever again permitted so close to dense housing. Zoning laws evolved. Setback requirements expanded. The city learned, slowly, to separate heavy industry from human habitation, a lesson many other cities would take far longer to absorb. In the end, the Boston Molasses Flood endures not because it was large, it claimed fewer lives than many factory fires of the era, but because it was so utterly unexpected. A disaster that defied logic, mocked preparedness, and turned the everyday into the lethal. It reminds us that danger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it flows, quietly, thickly, and with devastating patience. And so, the story continues, not in courtrooms or textbooks alone, but in the quiet vigilance of engineers who test twice, in the voices of neighbors who speak up about cracks in the wall, in the memory of a city that learned, through syrup and sorrow, that safety is never an afterthought. It is the foundation of everything that follows. Because once you've seen a wave of molasses tear a firehouse from its moorings, you understand that no structure is truly inert, that every tank, every bridge, every pipeline carries within it the potential for both service and catastrophe, and that the line between them is drawn not by fate, but by choice. In the years after 1925, as Boston rebuilt and the nation industrialized at breakneck speed, the Molasses Flood became a whispered cautionary tale among civil engineers, passed down in classrooms at MIT and Tufts, cited in internal memos when a project manager pushed to cut corners. Remember Boston, they'd say, not as a joke, but as a creed. And the victims? Their names, long absent from official markers, have slowly returned to public memory, thanks to historians, genealogists, and descendants who refused to let them be reduced to statistics. Pasquale Jantosca, a 19-year-old labourer. Bridget Clockerty, who lost her husband and brother in the same wave. John M. Barry, a city clerk crushed while walking home for lunch. Each life a thread in the fabric of a neighbourhood that carried the weight of corporate indifference. The flood also revealed the limits of early 20th century emergency response. There were no hazmat teams, no structural collapse units, no coordinated disaster protocols. Just brave men and women improvising with ropes, ladders, and sheer will. Their efforts saved dozens. but many more might have lived if rescue had been faster, better equipped, less hindered by the hardening syrup. That realization helped spur the professionalization of urban emergency services in the decades that followed. Even the molasses itself tells a story. Forensic analysis decades later showed it was unusually dense, nearly 1.4 times the density of water, making it far more destructive than a water wave of the same height. And as it cooled below 50 degrees, its viscosity spiked, trapping victims not by drowning alone, but by immobilization. A slow, suffocating entombment. Yet in retelling, we focus not on the horror, but on the humanity that rose to meet it. Today, Langone Park hosts Little League games where children chase fly balls across grass that once ran black. Tourists stroll past the plaque without a second glance. But for those who know, the ground holds memory. The air on certain days still carries the faintest echo of something sweet turned tragic. And the legacy lives on in regulation. The US now requires rigorous stress testing for all large storage vessels, independent engineering reviews, regular inspections by certified professionals, standards that trace their philosophical roots back to a tank that should never have stood untested in the heart of a city. The Boston Molasses Flood was not an act of God. It was an act of omission, a cascade of small failures, rushed construction, ignored warnings, absent oversight that culminated in a single, shattering moment. And in that, it remains profoundly modern. For our age too, is shaped by the accumulation of overlooked risks, by systems stretched thin, monitored poorly, assumed to be safe until they are not. But there is hope in the aftermath, in the fact that change did come, that laws were rewritten, that engineers now speak of duty to the public as a sacred trust, that a disaster born of negligence helped forge a culture of responsibility. So we remember, not to dwell in sorrow, but to honor vigilance, not to assign blame, but to renew commitment. Because the next tank is always being built somewhere, and someone must ask, have we tested it? Not just with water, but with conscience. For the true measure of progress is not how grandly we build, but how humbly we question, how willingly we pause before pressing forward, how deeply we listen to the groans in the steel, the whispers of those who live beneath the shadow of our creations. In 2023, a team from the National Institute of Standards and Technology revisited the Molasses Flood as part of a study on historical infrastructure failures. They concluded that the tank's collapse was entirely preventable, not by advanced technology, but by basic diligence, by filling it with water, as was standard practice elsewhere, by hiring a qualified engineer, as the law would soon require, by choosing caution over convenience, simple acts, yet revolutionary in their implications. And in Boston, the memory has found new life. School children from the Elliott K-8 school, just blocks from the disaster site, now perform a short play each January. They portray firefighters, mothers, engineers. They recite the names of the dead. They pour dark syrup down a model street to watch its path, not to frighten, but to teach that history is not distant, it is underfoot. Even the language around the event has shifted. Once called the Great Molasses Flood, it is now often referred to as the Boston Molasses Disaster or the North End Tank Collapse. Terms that carry more gravity, less whimsy. A quiet correction to decades of dismissive headlines that called it the Great Sticky Wave or Boston's Sweet Catastrophe, as if tragedy could be softened by sugar. but the syrup itself refused to be trivialized. It stained the city's conscience, and in doing so, helped forge a new ethic. One that recognizes that safety is not a luxury, but a covenant between builder and bystander, corporation and community, present and future. Today, as climate change accelerates and aging infrastructure groans under new pressures, the lessons of January 15, 1919 feel urgently contemporary. A burst reservoir in California, a chemical spill in West Virginia, a bridge collapse in Baltimore. Each echoes the same warning, that systems left unexamined become time bombs, and that the cost of prevention is always less than the price of regret. Yet Boston's story also offers redemption, not in the form of monuments or grand reparations, but in the quiet evolution of standards, in the daily choices of professionals who choose integrity over expediency, in the fact that no American city has seen a disaster quite like it since. Because the Molasses Flood did not just end lives, it ended an era of blind faith in industrial might. It marked the moment when society began to demand that those who shape our world be held to account, not after the collapse, but before it. And so, the wave recedes, not into myth, but into meaning. A dark, slow-moving reminder that the sweetest promises mean nothing without the strength to uphold them. In the end, the flood was not about molasses. It was about us. About the choices we make when no one is watching. About the weight of responsibility carried not by heroes in capes, but by engineers checking blueprints, inspectors walking job sites, neighbors speaking up about a leak they've seen for weeks. It was about the quiet courage of doing things right, even when it costs more, takes longer, or earns no applause. And in that sense, the Boston Molasses Flood is not a relic. It is a mirror, reflecting back our own era's vulnerabilities, our own untested tanks, literal and metaphorical, that hum with unseen pressure. From aging water mains beneath American cities to algorithms shaping public discourse without oversight. The forms evolve, but the principle remains. Systems without accountability are systems waiting to fail. Yet there is grace in the aftermath, in how a working-class neighborhood, battered and grieving, refused to be erased. How Italian, Irish, and Jewish families, often pitted against one another in the politics of the time, stood shoulder to shoulder in the syrup-soaked streets. How their collective action became a blueprint for community resilience. Even the legal victory, though modest by today's standards, planted seeds that would bloom for generations. The $300,000 settlement distributed among families, many of whom had lost sole breadwinners, was not just compensation. It was recognition, a formal acknowledgement that their lives mattered enough to be protected by law, that a corporation could not treat a neighborhood as disposable. And the engineering profession, once dominated by self-taught men and corporate loyalists, began its slow transformation into a discipline bound by ethics. By the 1930s, licensing laws spread across states. By the 1950s, peer review became standard. By the 21st century, public welfare was enshrined as the first canon of engineering codes worldwide. All traceable, in part, to a tank that burst on a winter afternoon in Boston. Today, if you stand at the corner of Commercial Street and Foster Street, where the tank once loomed, you see only trees, a basketball court, the glint of harbour light. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the clatter of horse hooves, the laughter of children, the distant clang of a factory bell. A world on the edge of modernity, unaware that its ordinary day was about to become history. We tell this story not to frighten, but to fortify. Not to dwell in the past, but to shape the future. Because every time an inspector insists on a second test, every time a community demands transparency about a nearby facility, every time a student chooses engineering not for profit, but for purpose, the wave is held back. The Molasses Flood teaches us that disaster is rarely sudden. It is the final note in a long-neglected symphony of warning signs, and that safety is not a moment, but a practice, sustained daily by countless unseen hands. So we remember Antonio Di Stasio, George Leahy, Isaac Gonzalez, and the others, not as victims of a bizarre accident, but as witnesses to a truth we must never forget, that the structures we build reflect the values we hold, and that when those values are compromised, the ground beneath us can give way. But it can also be rebuilt, stronger, wiser, with deeper foundations. And that perhaps is the sweetest legacy of all. Because legacy is not measured in monuments, but in moments. When a young engineer reviewing plans for a new storage facility in Houston or Chicago or Portland pauses and asks, what if it fails? When a city council votes to fund infrastructure upgrades instead of deferring them another year. When a whistleblower reports a crack in a pipeline, knowing it might cost them their job but save lives. Those are the ripples of Boston's dark tide, and the science continues to speak. In 2021, researchers at Northeastern University used 3D modeling to simulate how the molasses wave interacted with the urban canyon of the North End. They found that narrow streets amplified its force, channeling it like a river through stone. That buildings on corners suffered the worst damage. Insights now applied to flood modeling in cities worldwide. Even disasters long past can light the path forward. Meanwhile, the families endure. Descendants of survivors gather every few years for quiet reunions. They share yellowed photographs, newspaper clippings, stories passed down like heirlooms. One great-granddaughter of a firefighter who pulled victims from the syrup now works as a structural engineer. She says she chose her path because someone had to make sure it never happened again. The Molasses Flood also reshaped how we think about industrial siting. No longer is it acceptable to place massive storage tanks in the heart of residential districts without rigorous risk assessment. Buffer zones, emergency response plans, community right-to-know laws all owe something to the lessons of 1919. And in education, the case is now taught not just in law and engineering schools, but in ethics courses, as a study in organizational blindness, in how groupthink, profit pressure, and bureaucratic inertia can silence dissenting voices, until it's too late. Yet the most enduring truth may be the simplest, that ordinary people faced with extraordinary chaos will rise, not because they are trained for it, but because they care. The shopkeeper who used his delivery cart to ferry the injured, the school teacher who turned her classroom into a triage centre, the sailor who dove into the molasses again and again until he collapsed from exhaustion. Their names are lost to time, but their actions echo. And so the story does not end. It cycles through courtrooms, classrooms, construction sites, through every regulation that demands proof over promise, through every citizen who dares to ask, is this safe? Because the next great wave may not be sweet. It may be fire, water, steel, or silence, but the defense against it remains the same: vigilance, humility, and the unwavering belief that no one should have to live in the shadow of a tank that was never tested. In Boston, the harbour tides still turn. The North End bustles with life. And on warm days, if you press your ear to the old brick walls near the park, you won't hear molasses. But you might hear something just as powerful: the sound of a city that learned and chose to remember. Not just with words, but with action. Because memory without change is merely nostalgia. And Boston, for all its old bones and cobblestone charm, has always been a city that builds, sometimes recklessly, often brilliantly, but always forward. In the 1930s, as New Deal programs poured federal funds into public works, Boston's engineers carried the molasses lesson into new projects. The Sumner Tunnel, the Mystic River bridges, the expanded sewer system, all subjected to layers of review that would have been unthinkable in 1915. Not because regulations demanded it alone, but because a generation of professionals had seen what happened when they didn't. And the legal precedent kept growing. In 1947, during the Texas City disaster, an ammonium nitrate explosion that killed nearly 600 the molasses case was cited in early liability arguments. In the 1980s, during the Bhopal gas tragedy, international human rights lawyers pointed to Boston as an early example of corporate accountability for industrial harm. The ripples had become waves of their own. Even in popular imagination, the tone has shifted. Documentaries now treat the flood with gravity. Museum exhibits at the Bostonian Society include fragments of the tank's rivets, alongside letters from survivors. School curricula in Massachusetts integrated into units on civic responsibility. No longer a punchline, but a pivot point. And technology, once the source of the failure, now helps preserve its truth. Laser scans of Langone Park map the exact elevation changes that shaped the flood's path. Augmented reality apps allow visitors to point their phones and see a ghostly overlay of the tank towering over the street. History made visible, not to frighten, but to instruct. Yet the most profound legacy may be cultural. A quiet shift in how Bostonians and Americans view the relationship between industry and community. The idea that a company's right to operate carries with it a duty to protect, that profit cannot be divorced from responsibility, that the people who live near the tanks, the pipes, the plants, are not collateral, but neighbours. This ethos, born in syrup and sorrow, now underpins environmental justice movements, workplace safety reforms, and even debates over AI governance. Because the core question remains unchanged: who bears the risk and who gets to decide? And so, the molasses flood endures not as a curiosity, but as a compass, pointing always toward accountability, toward care, toward the simple, radical act of asking, what if we're wrong? For in the end, the tank did not fail because molasses is dangerous. It failed because people stopped wondering what could go wrong. And as long as we keep wondering, as long as we test, as long as we listen, the wave will never come again. Because the true monument to January 15th, 1919 was never meant to be bronze or stone. It was meant to be built into the bones of the systems we rely on every day, in the calibrated pressure gauges on storage tanks across the country, in the mandatory peer reviews before a single rivet is driven, in the whistleblower protections that empower a junior engineer to say, this isn't safe, and in Boston, the memory is woven into the city's rhythm. During winter thaws, when the ground softens and old pipes groan, veteran utility workers double-check valves near industrial zones, not because regulations require it that day, but because the story is part of their training, passed down like a trade secret of conscience. Even the language of emergency response has absorbed its lessons. Modern incident commanders speak of sticky situations not as slang, but as a technical reminder. Some disasters don't just flood, they entrap. They require specialized extraction, patience, and tools designed for viscosity, not just volume. protocols refined in part from the chaos of 1919, and the families, they keep watch in their own way. In 2022, a great-nephew of Bridget Clafferty donated her handwritten account of the day to the Massachusetts Historical Society. In it, she describes hearing a sound like the world tearing open, then silence, then the cries. Her words, preserved in ink faded by time, now help train crisis counsellors in trauma-informed response. Meanwhile, engineering students from around the world make pilgrimages to the North End, not for grand spectacle, but for quiet reflection. They stand where the tank stood, measure the distance to the firehouse, calculate the force of the wave, and then they return to their labs, their drafting tables, their code, carrying with them a question: will my work protect or endanger? That is the flood's final gift. Not fear, but focus. Not paralysis, but purpose. Because history does not repeat, but it does instruct. And Boston's syrupy catastrophe teaches us that the most dangerous failures are not those born of malice, but of assumption, the belief that it's always been fine, that someone else checked, that it's just molasses. But nothing is just anything when lives are at stake. And so, the story closes not with an ending, but with an invitation to look at the world around us, not as finished, but as fragile, not as given, but as entrusted. For every bridge we cross, every subway we ride, every tap we turn, rests on a chain of choices made long ago, by people who chose to test the tank, and by those who, one winter day in 1919, paid the price when others did not. We honour them not with monuments alone, but with vigilance, with integrity, with the quiet, daily courage to build a world that holds, because the work is never truly done. As long as steel can fatigue, as long as pressure can build, as long as human judgment can falter, the need for care remains. And in an age of automation, artificial intelligence, and infrastructure pushed beyond its design life, that need has only grown. Consider this: the average age of a US water main is over 45 years. Many natural gas pipelines date to the 1940s, and thousands of industrial storage tanks sit near communities, some inspected regularly, others not. The ghosts of 1919 whisper in the rust, in the creak of aging joints, in the silence of unmonitored sensors. But Boston's legacy offers more than warning. It offers a blueprint for repair, for how a city can transform grief into governance, trauma into standards, loss into law, and that model has travelled. From the chemical plants of Louisiana to the dam safety programs of California, the principle endures: test, review, listen, act. Even in global contexts, the Molasses Flood resonates. In India, after the 2020 Visakhapatnam gas leak, activists cited Boston as proof that corporate negligence must have consequences. In Europe, engineering ethics courses use the case to discuss the duty of care beyond national borders. What happened in a Boston alley a century ago now informs international industrial policy. And back in the North End, the story lives in unexpected ways. Local bakeries sometimes feature molasses flood cookies in January. Dark, dense, bittersweet with proceeds, supporting engineering scholarships. A small gesture, yes, but one that turns memory into mentorship. More importantly, the city has institutionalized remembrance. The Boston Fire Department includes the Engine 31 collapse in its historical training, not to dwell on tragedy, but to underscore why structural awareness matters during emergencies. cadets learn that disasters don't follow scripts, that sometimes the greatest threat isn't fire or flood, but something no one anticipated. And that is perhaps the deepest truth the flood reveals, that preparedness isn't about predicting the exact danger. It's about cultivating the mindset to respond to any danger with clarity, compassion, and competence. So when a child in Langone Park asks, "What happened here?" the answer is no longer just a tank burst. It's people learned. They learned that expertise matters, that oversight saves lives, that communities deserve transparency, and that sweetness unchecked can drown, but vigilance sustained can lift. And so the narrative circles back, not to the explosion, but to the aftermath, not to the wave, but to the hands that reached into it. For in the end, the Boston Molasses Flood is not a story about syrup. It is a story about us, about what we build, what we protect, and what we choose to remember. Because memory, when honored with action, becomes a living thing. And in Boston, that life pulses through every updated building code, every certified inspection, every engineer who walks a site not with a clipboard alone, but with conscience. The flood also reshaped journalism. In the days after the disaster, reporters from the Boston Post and the Globe didn't just tally the dead, they investigated. They tracked the tank's construction logs, interviewed former workers, exposed the lack of testing. Their reporting helped fuel public outrage that made the landmark trial possible. A reminder that accountability often begins not in courtrooms, but in newsrooms. And in education, the case is now a staple in interdisciplinary studies. Law students dissect the liability arguments. Engineering students analyze the metallurgical flaws. Ethics students debate the moral weight of should have known, all converging on a single truth. Complex systems demand complex responsibility. Even art has carried the torch. In 2019, a local sculptor installed a temporary sound piece near the plaque, gentle, rhythmic dripping, interspersed with faint whispers of names. It played only at noon, for 30 minutes, the exact window of the disaster. Passers-by stopped, listened, and for a moment, the present touched the past. But the most powerful continuation happens in silence, in the unspoken pact between generations of Bostonians to never again allow profit to override prudence, to treat infrastructure not as invisible backdrop, but as sacred trust. And globally, the lesson echoes. When a chemical plant in Germany installs redundant pressure sensors, it owes something to Boston. When a city in Japan mandates community drills for industrial accidents, it walks a path first charted in the sticky streets of the North End. For the flood proved that disasters are not isolated events. They are intersections of technology and ethics, of power and vulnerability, of haste and consequence, and that their aftermath can either entrench injustice or ignite reform. Boston chose reform. Slowly, imperfectly, but surely. And so, as we stand on the threshold of new industrial frontiers, autonomous systems, genetic engineering, climate adaptation, the Molasses Flood offers an ancient wisdom wrapped in modern urgency. Build as if lives depend on it, because they do, and always have. From the first brick laid in the North End to the last line of code written in a server farm, the question remains the same.